It's great to have you here this evening for Raising the Bar Adelaide 2020. For those of you who've been to previous Raising the Bar events, welcome back. For those who are newcomers, Raising the Bar is an initiative that started about 7 or 8 years ago in New York, where students from Columbia University and New York University thought it'd be a good idea to bring academics and experts into bars and pubs, so combining popular culture and education. Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing Luke Broomhall, who is a forensic psychologist. Luke will be talking about murder, violence and psychopathy in South Australia. This is, I think, the third time. Can't hear me? Is that better?
Music.
We'll just try and get our IT helper to improve things. I hope that's a little bit better.
Can you guys get the speaker down? Huh? Can you guys get the music down?
Yeah,
you got it. Cool. Thank you. Cheers.
Is that better?
They're on it.
Apologies, I'm at the mercy of the IT guys, so hopefully
and the venue
things improve. Okay, I'll just repeat that. So the Raising the Bar initiative started in New York about 7 or 8 years ago by students at Columbia University and New York University who wanted to combine popular culture and education, so they brought a whole lot of guest speakers into bars. Since that time, Raising the Bar has spread across the world. It's held in London, Auckland, Hong Kong, Sydney, and here in Adelaide. In fact, Adelaide is the only city in the world this year who will be holding a Raising the Bar event. Luke Broomhall is our speaker this evening. Luke is a forensic psychologist. He spoke at the inaugural Raise the Bar in this venue 2 years ago. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it last year. The topic for tonight's speech is murder, violence and psychopathy in South Australia. And I encourage you all to use social media to let people know that you're here for the event. But without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Luke Broomhall, our guest speaker. Welcome, Luke.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are we this evening? Excellent. Very nice to see you here. Thank you, Robert, and thank you to Norwood's Payneham St Peter's Council for having the bravery to put on Raising the Bar among these COVID times. It's a very brave initiative to put forward, but we're very glad that the Council has pushed ahead with that. So, tonight's topic, murder, psychopathy and violence. And it begs the question to me always, who is it that comes out to these talks? Because we know in society that generally that psychopaths are around about 1% of the population, or just a bit less than 1% of the population. But there are different statistics for different groups of people. We know that in chief executives, CEOs of organisations, Lord Mayors of city councils. He missed it too. Some lawyers, corporate bankers, the proportion of psychopathic traits increases somewhat. So you might be looking at maybe 10 or 15% in those populations. But I wonder about this group of people in this room today. We've got 80 people here, we may be looking at 10%. Psychopaths like to hear about themselves. So there may be 8 people who are psychopaths. And you can spot them. They're the ones that just came up to your table and took a chair without asking. And they're just going to sit, or they come and sit at your table and eat your food. Well, generally they're more clever than that. So we'll be talking about psychopaths, we'll be talking about murder, we'll be talking about violence and aggression. Won't be talking about some other aspects. We won't talk about narcissists tonight terribly much. You can always tell the narcissists, they're the ones sitting in the front row, and welcome tonight as well. It's very nice to see you, and thank you for coming out. So tonight, there are a couple of things I'd like to get through before we actually start, a couple of acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet tonight on the lands of the Kaurna people, the custodians of the Adelaide Plain. We respect their cultural and spiritual connection to the land and waterways, and we honour their leaders past, present and emerging. And bloody hell, we better start listening to them if we want to save the joint. I think they're the ones who have got the ideas. Second thing I'd like to say is that I'm going to be talking about some cases that I've been involved in South Australia over the last 10 or 15 years as a forensic psychologist. None of the things I'm going to talk about tonight are, they're all in the public arena. Everything I'm going to talk about tonight has been put in the public arena. The relationship between media and courts when it comes to people's profiles is really interesting. There's been some matters that are suppressed, details do not emerge. One of the cases I'm going to talk about tonight, I know for a fact that the Supreme Court judge who presided over that matter provided my report, in-depth report, 25-page report on this individual to the media for them to go through, and they wrote a rather large expose on this person that I'm going to talk about. So these matters are in the public domain. I'm not going to talk about anything tonight that breaches anyone's confidentiality. The third thing I'd like to say before I begin, and I think this is a really important point, everybody's fascinated with murder. I don't know why that is particularly. I guess I work in the area, so I guess I should know. But all these crime shows from America, all these crime programs, there's small villages in England who don't have any people in them because they're all murdered and clergy investigate them. I don't quite understand what the fascination is there. There's serial killers around every corner in America, of course, as well. So people are fascinated with the perpetrators. But I'd like to take a moment before we begin talking about the perpetrators to acknowledge the victims and the families of the victims. Because some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight are pretty horrific in terms of actions that have been perpetrated on innocent people. And I'd like to acknowledge that those actions don't happen in a vacuum, that they happen to people who lose their lives, and the family has to live with all of the consequences that come from those events. So I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge the families as well. So in terms of what we're going to talk about tonight and my background, I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction as to forensic psychology and me and my background. Then we'll get into some theoretical aspects and then some practical examples around violence, psychopathy, why people harm other people, and some dominant theoretical paradigms around those aspects. Now, as a forensic psychologist, we don't profile for police. It's not the American sort of style in forensic psychology. The American system is a little bit more where police do the policing and the forensic psychologists and the experts do the profiling. In Australia, the police seem to think they know more than we do about those things. They tend to take those things on themselves. With apologies to any police in the room, you do a fantastic job, thank you very much. They don't tend to call on our expertise all that much, which is a bit of a shame if you ask me. So forensic psychology tends to be when a person has been arrested, then we kind of get involved from there. So from that point on, when a person's been arrested, we might be involved in an assessment of that individual before they go to trial. We might provide an assessment on that individual for court after they've been found guilty or after they've pleaded guilty. A lot of my work as a forensic psychologist happens at that post or plea finding or plea entering, so a guilty plea where the person goes through his sentencing. That's where a lot of lawyers will refer through to me for a profile of that individual. And in a lot of cases, a risk assessment, which I will undertake around risk of violence or risk of sexual offending, risk of further offending down the track. So that's kind of where we get involved. From there, we might get involved as forensic psychologists in providing treatment. So services for individuals who sexually offend or are violent and aggressive, drugs and alcohol, personality disorders, those kind of aspects. So that's kind of where forensic psychology sits. And it certainly, unfortunately, isn't around catching serial killers. We don't actually have a lot of serial killers in Australia, and I think that's a good thing. I don't think it would be a good thing if there were a lot of... It's not like in America where there's serial killers running around everywhere. There's a couple of notable examples, of course. Malat, Snowtown, those kind of aspects could be classed as serial killers. Mostly in Australia we don't get a lot of serial killers. Most of the research that happens around serial killings happens in the States, Europe, and sometimes in the UK and Canada as well, which is where a lot of the forensic psychology research is being done. My primary workplace at the moment is called PsychCheck. We developed the system which reviews child protection workers to work in residential care. So if you want to work in residential care with vulnerable children under guardianship, you'll have to come through our process. So that keeps us fairly busy. Otherwise, medico-legal assessments for court, a little bit of treatment, psychological wellbeing for workplaces is kind of my background and what I do. So tonight, what we're going to discuss, what I really want to get your heads around, as I get my head around it as well a little bit more, is to bust this myth where people think that people who murder are either mad or bad. That's the dominant paradigm of when you think about people who murder and why they murder. They're either mad or they're bad. And it comes from a place subjectively where we don't quite understand what people's motivations are. And I say subjectively because we have our own frame of reference about the world. We understand how we think the world works, and we know that we would never kill anybody else. Most of you, I'm hoping. The lady over there looks a little dicey, but apart from that, we like to think that we wouldn't do that. So it's very hard to put yourself in the mind of someone who would do that. And it's very easy then to fall into some of those colloquial terms. And they must be mad, or they must be just bad people, or even worse, evil. What does that even mean? We're talking about a sort of a Victorian sense of religious aspect of somebody being good or evil. I think from where we come in psychology and understanding human behaviour and personality, it's time to move past those paradigms. Good and bad and evil and those kind of things. We can bring a bit more understanding. So that's what I would like to do tonight, would be to bring a bit more understanding around these concepts and explode these concepts. They're useless. Let's not talk about mad and bad. Let's try and pull back the covers on what are the dominant theoretical paradigms on why people harm other people. I will, of course, talk about mental impairment, having said that I'm not going to talk about mad and bad. Colloquially, mad, I hate to use that term because the actual term that we should be using is mental impairment, and you can be found not guilty by reason of mental impairment, which I'll talk about today as well. I'm going to talk about dolly incapax, which is children. We'll talk about parental filicide, so that's parents who harm their children. I'm going to talk about women who murder because there is a slightly different demographic around females who commit acts of murder and violence. And then what everybody I think is looking for is the structure of psychopathy. What's a psychopath? How do we identify psychopaths? What are the constructs that go around? How do we assess psychopathy? And some case examples in there as well that I'll be able to provide. But I'm also really going to have a look at, and this is going to shock a lot of people I suspect, normal people who murder. Not mad or bad. People that we've assessed, and I say we as a group of forensic psychologists who conduct these assessments, there's probably only half a dozen of us in South Australia, maybe 10, who regularly conduct these. And one of my colleagues conducted a few years ago a very prominent murder case, which I'll talk about, and to all intents and purposes, the person who perpetrated that crime was normal. Very hard to believe, but I'll take you through that a little bit and see if we can flesh that out a little bit more. And then I'm going to talk at the end about people who are murderers who haven't actually killed anybody. Getting really controversial towards the end. I'll talk a little bit about self-care and how we look after ourselves, and then at the end there'll be a little bit of time for questions. There'll be a microphone roaming around, so if you have some questions as we go along, don't be afraid to ask. So, let's go. What I think is important to understand before we get started into any of these concepts is how we look at personality structures. The dominant theoretical aspects around personality, Cattell, Goldberg, other researchers around personality, generally came up with the same sort of theoretical constructs around personality that centred around 5 factors. And if you want a nice acronym to remember these 5 factors, OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N, OCEAN. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. Those are the 5 main factors of personality. All personality constructs can be defined within those 5 terms. Now, let me introduce another concept to you. That is the concept of the graphic equalizer. Any one of you, there's a few people around who look old enough to remember what a graphic equalizer is on your stereo. On your amplifier, young people are going to be going, what's an amplifier? There's no young people here, oh my God. You're going to be going, what's an amplifier? Okay, so you have a bunch of dials to modulate sound. They sit on 0 in the middle, and they go to +10 and they go to -10. So each one of these factors of personality can be thought of like a graphic equalizer. You can be quite high on openness, +10, or you can be very low on openness, -10. So your graphic equalizer and personality, now you're starting to get the concept here of what I'm talking about. You can be, different people can be different levels of this graphic equalizer. Let me throw another curveball at you. Within each of these 5 factors, there are 6 facets. Each one of these 5 factors have 6 facets. That's 30 facets altogether. And they all exist on that graphic equalizer as well, which means that you can be high or low on any of those factors. Now we're talking about personality difference. You may be very similar to some of your friends or your family or your loved ones or your partner on some of those aspects, and that's why you come together. I've seen other aspects though where people come together and they're completely the opposite. And for some reason it works somehow. They manage to pull it together. So when we're talking about psychopathy, when we're talking about mental illness, when we're talking about mental health, when we're talking about any aspects of psychopathy or anything I'm going to be talking about tonight, remember the graphic equalizer. Because it's not always that a psychopath is a true psychopath. It might be that they have some traits, some facets where they're quite high, otherwise they're completely normal. But that one facet in a certain situation is enough to tip them over to the edge to act in a certain way. Some of the facets that I find quite interesting when it comes to looking at criminal behaviour. Dutifulness, under conscientiousness. So under conscientiousness, duty. Are you quite duty bound or do you like breaking the rules? Self-discipline. Do you like doing things methodically and as they should be done, or do you just let things get chaotic? Neuroticism, hostility and irritability. Are you someone who's quite calm and in control? Are you someone who flies off the handle? Where do you sit on that? Are you +10 or -10 in that? So these are the things we're looking to assess when we're looking to assess an individual. We're looking at how do they fall in these facets of personality. Now, I probably should mention a little bit about what we do as forensic psychologists in the interview. Now, I'm going to be a little bit careful here because I don't want to give away all the trade secrets. If you ever come to see me, I'm not going to want you coming in and knowing exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to be a little bit careful about lifting the veil completely. There's a lot of people ask me, what if people are lying to you? I was like, yeah, well, I guess some people do lie and some people lie quite well. But I've got 3 hours with you. And I'm going to start with, and I'm going to be really nice. You'll find me the nicest forensic psychologist you have ever met. And early on in the interview, I'm going to be looking for something that I can draw a connection on as well, without revealing too much of myself. But draw a connection with you so that you feel like I'm a nice, easygoing kind of guy. And you might even forget about the assessment context. I wouldn't, but you might. That's the idea. The idea is to get you nice and relaxed so that you'll talk to me about your life. Now, when it comes to lies, I'm going to go through everything in 3 hours. I'm going to ask you where you were born and where you grew up and about your parental relationships and your sibling relationships, where you're in school and your teachers and your friends. I'm going to go through the whole lot. All your relationships, all of your work history, and I'm going to be looking for consistency and patterns. Now, there are 2 things that I'm looking for as a forensic psychologist. One is internal consistency. Your story needs to make internal sense. That is, if you tell me at point A that this happened and then I'm going through and 2 hours later you tell me point B, which is a complete contrast, I'm going to pick that up. And I'm going to go back and quiz you about it. And most people start to lose it around about that point if they are deliberately lying. You have to be pretty good. I'm not saying that I'm, a lie detector or perfect at it, but internal consistency over a long period of time is quite difficult. The second thing I'm looking for is the pathway that you're describing to me consistent with what I know from my professional expertise and from the literature which I've read and continue to read over time? Is your behaviour consistent with what we know about people who have generally experienced what you've experienced? So you had a good stable background where your parents were loving and supportive and you went to 2 schools and you did well and you're married and you're still married and you've got kids and you've got stable employment and then you go off and do something completely... That doesn't make sense to me if you go off then and murder somebody. I'm going to be going, I'm not seeing any developmental signs here. So they're the 2 things that I'm going to be looking for in the forensic interview to put it together. The other advantage that I have, of course, is that I've got background documentation. I know what the charges are, I've got police reports, I've got your criminal history, I've got all these things and I'm going to be looking to put all that together as a big jigsaw puzzle. Now we're getting into the fascination of why I love my job. And I do love my job. It's fantastic. It's very, very exciting, very interesting. from time to time. Very sad from time to time as well, in terms of people suffering. So that's what we're looking for in personality. And when I'm talking through tonight about personality around any of these constructs, think about it in terms of that graphic equalizer. People have very high levels of a certain facet, or they can have very low levels of a certain facet. Where do you think you sit in some of these facets? Because, you know what, a certain amount of grandiosity isn't a bad thing. A certain amount of grandiosity is self-confidence. At low levels, you don't want low levels of grandiosity. You don't want to be someone who doesn't think much of themselves, won't put themselves forward, won't speak up. That's low self-confidence. That's low self-esteem. As the grandiosity bar starts to rise, we get a little bit more self-confidence. As it gets a little bit above zero into the plus territory, then we're starting to see a little bit more, you know, getting a bit more out there and speaking positively about yourself and putting yourself out there and talking yourself up. But the higher it goes, the more of a problem we start to see. Very grandiose. People who big note themselves all the time. And big note themselves to put other people down, or big note themselves in order to win positions they don't deserve, or big note themselves to put other people down around them. So you can see this scale starting to emerge from quite low levels to quite reasonable levels where it's actually reasonably healthy, to very high levels where it's not healthy at all. So the first aspect of understanding this mad or bad paradigm around people who will commit acts of violence, including murder, is mental impairment. Now, this is colloquially the mad aspect, and again, I don't like using that term, but that is how most of society understands that aspect. When we're talking about mad, and I'll stop using that term now, we're talking about mental impairment. Now, under Section 269 of the Criminal Law Consolidation Act in South Australia, you can be found not guilty by reason of mental impairment. It is quite a high bar, let me tell you, in terms of meeting the threshold for it legally. I started out doing a lot of these assessments probably 10 years ago. People would refer through, and there were people who I would assess who had intellectual disabilities, and I'd test their IQ, and they had an IQ in the mildly intellectually low IQ range, so below 70, who didn't understand really what they were doing, and they still were found competent to stand trial and plead. I've had lawyers ringing me and saying, I cannot get instructions from my client. It just makes no sense at all. There is something really seriously wrong here. And I'll meet with them as well, and it's kind of difficult, and yeah, the mental age is not fantastic, and the courts will still find them competent. In order to meet the bar for Section 269 under the Criminal Law Consolidation Act, you basically need to have psychosis. Now, psychosis. Psychosis is a departure from reality. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about a mental impairment defence, or not guilty by reason of mental impairment. Under the Criminal Law Consolidation Act, Part A, you have to not know the nature and quality of your actions, or not know that your actions were wrong, or not be able to control your actions. You have to meet one of those three limbs. Under not guilty by reason of mental impairment in South Australia, it's generally psychosis, the departure from reality, where people don't know the nature and quality of their conduct. That is the stipulation for mental impairment under that section. Now, what is psychosis? Psychosis is not generally very well understood. And I think there's a lot of society that thinks that, oh, well, if they're found not guilty by reason of mental impairment, it's just an excuse. Or they've got off lightly, or they're not going to jail, so they must be faking it. 3 psychiatrists need to go through and assess and agree that the person at the time of committing the offence was under a delusional psychotic state. That is, they did not understand the nature and quality of their actions. So in psychosis, really serious when you see it, and it's actually quite sad as well to see, where people really do not know who they are, where they are, and they believe very fantastical things. They believe their thoughts might be being interfered with. They believe their thoughts might be broadcast. They believe that people might be putting thoughts inside of their head to make them believe things. They think they can influence the thoughts of others from across the room. With delusions, so paranoid delusions, where people think they're being watched or singled out, that's a really common one. My teeth there's a radio implanted in my teeth, and they're reading my thoughts from the satellite that's going over. Grandiose delusions, where people believe that they have special powers, that they are someone who is superhuman for some reason. Or depressive delusions, where people believe that they're guilty of some terrible crime that's been committed. So these delusional aspects are quite prominent and quite strong. And when you listen to somebody who's in a paranoid delusional state or a grandiose or a depressive delusional state, it's quite obvious that what they're talking about is fantastical and is not going to be happening in all reality. A hallucination is where somebody sees or believes or smells even. There are olfactory hallucinations where people see things that aren't there. So you might get delusions or hallucinations within these psychotic states. There are a couple of notable examples, too many notable examples unfortunately. There was a 76-year-old woman a few years ago who attacked and killed her husband with an axe and 2 knives. She was suffering from a psychotic disorder, so a break with reality. She reported seeing dead people who weren't there and other people in her field of vision. They were trying to talk to her, but she couldn't understand what they were saying, but she understood that they were telling her to kill her husband. Because she was labouring under the delusion that he was, there was something, I can't remember what it was, but it was something that he was doing wrong or he was going to harm her or he was an alien or something along those lines, I can't quite remember. So she felt scared and paranoid and she felt that her only course of action was to kill him. So, and she was diagnosed with psychosis and found not guilty by reason of mental impairment. The other notable ones from a number of years ago, Dave Janzau, who killed his young son Luca in his car, believing that he was possessed by the devil, and that he was freeing him from that burden. Catherine Palin, who I saw on the day that she drowned her 2-year-old in a dam, which again she had been quite unwell psychiatrically under paranoid delusions for many months and unfortunately not been able to engage with treatment. And believed that her daughter was going to be abducted, that there were people following her, and the only way to keep her daughter safe was to take the action she took. That was the bizarrest interview. It was in a police station at Murray Bridge. She was behind the glass and she was obviously hungry and was eating. The police had got a McDonald's, so I was interviewing her while she was eating McDonald's. And then I saw there were just the paranoid associations about what she was believing, but every now and again she'd kind of stop and look around and there'd be this little kind of acknowledgement of where she was and what had happened, and then she'd just kind of go back into the paranoid delusions again. And Cy Walsh, who killed his father, Phil Walsh, the Crows coach, who was also found not guilty by reason of mental impairment. So the other thing that can happen, and a number of other people I've seen over time, who will step down from psychiatric facilities through a place called Ashton House, which is connected with James Nash. Now, the idea with Ashton House is that people have a little bit more access into the community. It's a good part of their rehabilitation. They only get there when their psychiatric illness is stable. Now, you think about somebody who's had a psychotic illness, who's killed somebody else believing that they were the devil or whatever the hallucination or delusion was, and then they become well again through treatment, through medication, through therapy. They become well and they realise that what they did was not actually happening and horrible and they've perpetrated this crime. They have to live with that for the rest of their lives. But rehabilitation is there in order to be able to integrate people back into the community. I've actually seen a number of people who have stepped down through, not necessarily murder, but other violent crimes, stabbing and all those kind of areas, who have reintegrated with treatment back into the community quite successfully. They're on licences so that they're monitored and they have to report to their doctor and make sure they're still taking their medication and still well, but they can step down back into the community. And it seems that there's this big outcry whenever that happens, especially around Cy Walsh, because it's very high profile with Phil Walsh. So you see to the media, Cy Walsh is going to step down into the community, so he should. If he's well enough and the psychiatrists think that his mental illness is under control, then he is going to be able to reintegrate back into society. I guess people have their own viewpoints and opinions on that. So there you go. There's number one. That's the first, I guess, one of the bigger aspects of why people may murder or harm or commit violence to others. Mental impairment. Let's talk quickly about Dolly Incapax. Dolly Incapax is in all around Australia, actually, in all of the states of Australia. We'll talk about South Australia. Under the age of 10, you are deemed 10 years of age, so a child under the age of 10 does not have the mental capacity to form mens rea, which is the guilty act. They don't understand their actions. Literally, Dolly Incapax is incapable of evil. Now again, we get these Latin terms and these old colloquial or these old legal terms. Incapable of evil. So before the age of 10 years, if someone murders somebody, they are incapable of that action in terms of forming intent, which is a central part of a guilty finding in a criminal case. So therefore they are incapable of evil and they cannot be prosecuted. But in South Australia, as in the rest of Australia, between the age of 10 and 14, it is up to the prosecution to prove that the person, or the child in this case, knew that what they were doing was not just naughty, but was wrong. So the burden of proof is on the prosecution. If the prosecution can't prove that the person knew what they were doing was wrong, then Dolly Incapax applies. Now, there was a push, and I was involved in it. I didn't get up, unfortunately, to the Attorneys General around Australia to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 14 to, I think they were looking at 16 or 18, I think it was 16. It didn't get up, unfortunately. So Dolly Incapax between 10 and 14 still applies. And the reason I mention it is because there have been a number of people who I've seen at the age of 12 or so. I think I've got one coming through shortly, actually, who a number of years ago sexually assaulted a neighbour who was 8 and he was 12. So I've got to form an opinion then around whether this person 3 years ago understood the difference between naughty and wrong in terms of the harm that it caused. So I'm looking at school reports, old psych reports, I'm going to interview him, I'll psych test him, and I've got to come up with an opinion about whether this person thought those actions were just naughty or whether they knew the wrongfulness of them. Parental Filicide. So, parents who kill their children. That is a particularly horrible thought. And most people do actually have a lot of trouble getting their heads around that. Why would anybody kill their own child? How would anybody kill their own child? So there's been a lot of research around these areas. Unfortunately in Australia, 27, I think the average is, 27 children die at the hands of their parents each year. Of those, 90% are killed by one parent, not both. 17% involve the suicide of the parent. And psychosis is found in 1 in 3 cases. So it might be easy to think that people who kill their own children are psychotic and they have a break with reality, but actually it's only 1 in 3. Which begs the question then, what about the other 2 in 3? What are we dealing with here in terms of the profile of people who aren't psychotic, who kill their own children? So, research that was undertaken by Resnick and colleagues a few years ago came up with a number of aspects to describe the killing of children. Unwanted child was one, so the child was not wanted in the relationship. Altruism. Sorry. How's that? Is that better? Okay. Altruism is where the parent believes that they're doing the child good by harming them. So they believe that there's some sort of risk, or they're ill, or something along those lines, where the child is going to be saved by their actions. Spousal revenge is another one as well, and this is one that does get reported in the press. There are a number of examples. The one that springs to mind is one from a few years ago. A bloke called Farquharson in Victoria drove his 3 children into a dam. I think they were aged 2, 5 and 7 or something along those lines. He said he had a coughing fit before he drove into the dam. He got himself out, so he drove into the dam and the car submerged. He managed to get himself out of the car, which is good of him. But his 3 children died. The reports from his friends indicated and phone calls indicated that he had said on a number of occasions derogatory things about his ex-wife and that he was going to get her in the end, and this was one of the ways he was going to hurt her. He actually thought that this was how he was going to get back at his wife, by killing their children. So spousal revenge is certainly reported in the press and one of the reasons. The last one, in terms of reasoning around theoretical paradigms of how parents kill their children, is accidental. We saw that in the case of Chloe Valentine a few years ago. Now, I say accidental in the sense that I interviewed the stepfather who put her on the motorbike. There wasn't an intent to harm her. It was certainly ill-advised. It was certainly, and that's putting it mildly, I think you could say, in terms of the actions that he took. The real danger in the actions came well before that from their actions and afterwards, after she was injured. And she was quite severely injured while they decided what they would do and Googled, went on eBay and all those kind of things before they got to a hospital too late. So accidental death is certainly another aspect of how parents can kill their children. So there you go, parental filicide. That's not a great topic to be talking about, is it? But it's one of the ways that people can inflict murder and harm on others. I want to talk about the female population as well, women who murder. It is demographically and from that psychological personality perspective, a different profile. Women aren't seen to be people who are naturally aggressive or naturally will harm anybody or kill anybody. It's certainly possible, I've certainly seen it. And the statistics bear that out as well. There was some research in the UK a few years ago. I think they said in a calendar year there were 121 murders and only 12 of them were perpetrated by females. And that seems to be a generally fairly stable statistic, around about 10%, sort of 5 to 10% of murders are perpetrated by females. And of that 5 to 10%, what are the major reasons that women will engage in these actions? It not being a natural tendency of women to be that aggressive and murdering. And you probably guessed the first one already. Colloquially, it's called battered women syndrome. It's also called ladies who stab because 80% of women who harm, it's usually spouses, use a knife or a sharp object. If you can explain that to me, that would be great. If you could hide the knives on the table. It's more accessible than a gun.
It's quieter.
Quieter as well than a gun, indeed. So in legal circles, it's ladies who stab, is the term. In 2/3 of cases where men kill women, there was going to be a separation or there was a separation. 2/3. The women who kill people they know, generally their partner or a friend or someone they know. They don't generally kill strangers. And I don't think people really understand, if you haven't gone through it, and obviously I haven't gone through it, but I've talked to enough people who have gone through it, to hear the stories of abuse and how horrible they are and perpetrated over a long period of time. We're not just talking about, one incident and the person snaps. We're talking about years of stalking and violence and emotional putting down and gaslighting, if you want to call it that, and just abuse, just derogatory put-downs. Withholding of money, withholding of resources, jealousy, paranoia, control, and then violence that comes along with it as well. And generally in those cases, it's women that get to a certain point where they think, they see the warning signs coming. He's been drinking again, he's starting to arc up again, I'm about to cop it again, and this time I'm not going to. Something snaps, or they make a decision where they just go, that's it, enough, and they take an action. And the courts are reasonably, it's starting to become a little bit more engaged with that as not a defence, but certainly a reasoning as to how that person came to that point in their lives. I want to talk for a minute about women in the custodial setting because, and it's one of my favourite, I wish it wasn't one of my favourites, but it's something that I will talk about quite strongly and passionately. The Adelaide Women's Prison must be one of the most archaic and awful places you could ever hope to visit. And I hope you don't ever have to visit it. It's old, it's run down, it's mouldy, the services are awful. There's about between 112, 120, 25 women incarcerated there at any one time. And the research that I've seen around Australia fits with the research that I know from Adelaide, and I worked at the women's prison between 2004 and 2007, so I know a little bit about working out there. So these statistics fit fairly well with my experience. 87% of women who go through the prison system have been the victims of sexual, physical and emotional abuse, and most of the time, all of those. 49%, 50%, and I think that's an underreport. Around about half of women in custody have experienced one form of child abuse or another. 60% have been forced or frightened into doing something sexually that they did not want to do in their lifetime. And of this group, 60% said they didn't seek help afterwards. Of the victims of sexual abuse as a child, 80% experienced sexual victimisation as an adult. Most didn't have secondary level education, secondary high school level education. Literacy levels were really low. Employment was low. Domestic violence is high. Only less than 50%, 45% were employed at the time they came into prison. 90% of women in New South Wales who were incarcerated had a serious diagnosable mental health issue in the 12 months prior to their incarceration. And only 50% had ever been properly assessed or treated. We have a captive population, literally a captive population of women who can and will engage in therapeutic and rehabilitative programs which will help them to not reoffend when they get out. And yet, we don't do enough. There's not enough resources in rehabilitation. It's just an area that most politicians would say is not a high yield in terms of being a vote getter. And yet we're talking about the mothers of the next generation. And I'm old enough now, having been in South Australia for the last 20 years working as a forensic psychologist, to see the same names coming through. The names of people who I might have assessed 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and their children coming through the system as young people. So it's really important that we intervene, and intervene as early as we can. Seeing as I'm an academic in a bar, I'm going to have a beer while I talk. I'd have thought getting academics into bars probably wouldn't be the issue. It's usually getting academics out of bars that's the issue. That's usually the problem. So let's talk about psychopaths. Ooh, quickly. There's a real misunderstanding around psychopathy and sociopathy. Have you heard those terms interchange? And people don't know what sociopaths are and what psychopaths are. So let me break that down for you. Now, in terms of similarities of psychopaths and sociopaths, they both have a disregard for the law and social mores. They both have a disregard for the rights of others. They don't feel guilt or remorse or emotional pain. They have a tendency to display violent behaviour. But they do have unique characteristics. Sociopaths are the ones, think Ted Bundy, living in the forest, middle of nowhere, doesn't want to socialise with people, not comfortable around people, really disorganised in their crime and in their violence, very impulsive, very erratic, don't form attachments with people, don't usually have jobs, living on the fringes of society. That's a sociopath. Psychopaths are very different. Psychopaths don't feel empathy. That's probably the main thing we're looking at with psychopaths. They just don't feel empathy. They don't feel anything for you or anyone else. They're quite charming, quite charismatic in their personalities. They are very manipulative, and they will use that charm to manipulate you in any relationship, work sense or romantic, whatever it might be. They learn to mimic emotions, but they don't feel them truly themselves. But they can get very good at mimicking emotions. So in a certain situation where it's appropriate to be sad, they'll feign sadness. They won't feel it, but they'll be able to feign it enough that you might believe it. Often well-educated, often have steady jobs, often can hold down relationships with people who may not know they have these tendencies. This is where it's really important to think of the graphic equalizer, because it's actually quite possible to turn empathy on and off, and we all do it all the time. There are certain situations for which I imagine you all have a huge amount of empathy. Your kids, your loved ones, your partner, your family. In most settings, you would have a good emotional connection, you would be able to form good empathy. There'll be other situations where you don't. Think about driving in your car and somebody cuts you off. There's no empathy for that person at that point. So we have the capacity to switch on and off empathy. I think about talking to my 8-year-old daughter and nearly being in tears when she was telling me some issue that was going on at school, which I can't remember now. That's bad, isn't it, in terms of empathy? But just being really emotional about it. And yet I talk to someone who's killed an 8-year-old and it doesn't affect me emotionally. It can't, as a forensic psychologist. I've got a job to do. It doesn't affect me, but I can't afford to be in tears at that point when I'm talking about it. So we have the ability to be able to work with our emotions, some better than others. Psychopaths in crime will be very planned, very careful, very methodical. They take care, they're planned. They're not usually using violence unless it's completely necessary or unless it gets to their ends quicker. Intelligent psychopaths make very good white-collar criminals or CEOs of large organisations or councils. Got it that time. In prisons, antisocial personality and psychopathy, antisocial personality disorders in prisons, no brainer, it's about 80% or 90%. It's quite high. But the psychopaths, around about 20% of the incarcerated population. And mostly they're not in for murder. They're in for theft, they're in for fraud, and they're in for serial rape. That's what psychopaths do, because you think about switching off empathy allows you to behave in a way against somebody else, not thinking about the pain and harm that you're causing. Serial rapists, that's the main parts. Around about 50% psychopaths have been charged with those. So they're not usually murderers. Psychopathy is made up of two factors. They split into factor 1 and factor 2. Factor 1 are the more narcissistic, white-collar, very smart, intelligent psychopaths. And there are 9 aspects of that. Glibness and superficial charm, smooth talking, engaging, very slick. As I'm reading through this list, you're all going, I know this, you're going, okay, tick, tick, so you're thinking about your boss or your partner or your boss. We'll go with boss, shall we? Grandiose self-worth. I am absolutely fantastic. I myself, arrogant sense of superiority in the room. Pathological lying. Pathological lying. Lying when they are lying and they know they're lying and they're caught they're lying and they do more lies in order to be able to get out of lying. Even when you thought, you're lying, I know you're lying, and I just called you out on lying, and yet you're lying again, but I actually don't know whether you're lying again now I'm confused. That's the point. I'm just going to keep lying, and at some point you're going to go, oh, I guess you must be telling the truth then. Very cunning, very manipulative. They will be able to see 3 or 4 moves ahead of you in terms of, I'm going to say that to that person, they're going to say it to that person, they're going to say it to that person over there, and I'm going to be completely free of it because that person thinks it was that person, and I've just put in this little bit of information. So very manipulative. They know how to manipulate people and work situations. Very cunning. No guilt, no remorse, no empathy, emotional poverty, lack of empathy, not taking responsibility for actions, and proneness to boredom and need for stimulation. They get excited by these novel people that they come across that they can manipulate, thinking about ways that they can actually do this. So they get bored easily. So they want to get entertained by manipulating situations. So they have 3 or 4 different scenarios on the go or more at any one time. That's your factor 1 psychopath. They're the white-collar criminals, they're the manipulative, the charming, the intelligent. Factor 2 is a little bit more chaotic, and it's what we see in general aspects of criminal activity that we'll come across. Parasitic lifestyle, so generations of being on the dole, exploiting other people financially, poor behavioural control, so very irritable, very aggressive, inappropriate expressions of anger and other emotions. No realistic long-term goals, so ask people, what are you going to do when you get out of prison? I'm going to open my own business. Okay, what are you going to be doing in this business? I'm going to be a florist. Excellent. You've been a florist before? No. Excellent. Good luck with that. Impulsiveness, irresponsibility, juvenile delinquency. We usually see in quite high factor 2 psychopaths. There's been a criminal history in adolescence. They've been breached for their parole. There's usually promiscuity in sexual relationships and criminal versatility, so lots of different crime that can happen. We assess psychopathy by using the main tool that's used is called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or the PCLR. You need to be trained in the PCLR, which I am. This is not a test you want to do well on. It's scored out of 30. This is not a score you want. You do not want to be scoring in the 20s. I think the cutoff is 24. This is not a test you want to do well on. I'm going to tell you about a couple of entertaining psychopaths that I've met over time. These guys, one of them I quite like, the other one I really didn't very much. I saw them both in treatment, and I'll preserve their confidentiality, although one's dead and the other's in jail, which is what happens to psychopaths generally. I'll use other names as well. Rick I first met 2004-5 probably when I was working in corrections, and just struck me by the fact that he was about 6'4" with a head like a bowling ball. He looked like the kind of guy that if you punched him you'd hurt yourself really badly. And he was big with it as well, like just a mountain of a man, tattoos all over him, but very engaging. I kind of liked him. He was pure psychopath, don't worry about that. Like, he used to say to me, like, he'd be the kind of person that people would come to if people owed them money, or if people took their child, or if people did something wrong, that he would, I sort of imagine him sort of sitting up there as sort of judge and jury going, you know, okay, yeah, that's pretty bad. All right, I'll go and do something about that. Or, nah, that's not worth my time. He took up moral causes. I think he actually said to me that somebody came to him and said that that her partner had snatched their child, and he went, "Oh, that's not right," and he went and got him and inflicted some damage along the way as well. Didn't like police very much. The police didn't like him very much either, as it turned out. Did a lot of drugs. Came in and saw me doing a lot of drugs. Different women, partners who would come in with him as well. K-Doc all over the place. But he always used to say to me, if I turn up on your doorstep, there's a reason why I'm there. Okay? The reason that you believe is right. It's kind of like this vigilante style, self-modelled. Huge psychopathic traits. The other bloke that I remember that I treated, he was scary. He was genuinely scary. I've met a lot of people in jail. I've met a lot of people who have committed a lot of violent crime. A lot of people who have done a lot of bad things in all sorts of different ways. There's only a handful who actually scare me, in the sense of like just so loose and not caring for you or themselves or anybody else that actually make them really terrifying. It's not just that Rick was 6'4", it was that, and built like a brick shithouse. He didn't care. If you're on the wrong side of him, he wouldn't care what he did. The other guy I saw, we'll call him Michael for want of a better term, he was a big guy as well, but just so unappreciative of other people, could not care less about you or himself or anybody else. One of the fun things he'd like to do would be to go to he told me he went to a car yard, got a Subaru Impreza from WRX from somewhere, and took the poor guy up into the Adelaide Hills and absolutely caned this thing. And took great, that's why he wanted to go, not to drive fast, but to cause fear and see the fear in the other guy's face. One of the things we're talking about there is really interesting in psychopaths is this high autonomic arousal threshold. So for us, skydiving or public speaking or something gets your adrenaline going. For him, that wasn't enough. He used to tell me, I don't know if this is true or not, but he used to tell me he used to like going shark diving or driving really fast down the freeway. That's what got his adrenaline going. Nothing else would. So the things that we find exciting, psychopaths generally don't. They need that higher level of arousal. The other psychopath who I saw was a Monte Extrada who murdered 2 girls at Corn. And people ask the question about whether psychopaths are born or whether they're made, the old nature-nurture debate. Literature would indicate that it's probably both. And neither are necessary for someone to turn into a psychopath. There are people who have psychopathic genetic markers who don't turn into psychopaths, and there are people who are psychopaths who don't have the genetic markers. But when they come together in both, you get a higher propensity for people to turn into psychopaths. So where they have the genetic predisposition and they have all those factors that we know about. And Amonte Estrada had them as well. He was born in Bolivia. His mother was a prostitute. She didn't look after him. He was beaten mercilessly. He didn't have food. He had to scrounge. He would run around the city doing all sorts of things until about the age of 9 or 10. His father, who lived here in Australia, went and got him and brought him back to Australia, but he never fit in. And he was a psychopath in the sense that when he got to school, he would make out that he liked people. And he did it well enough to be voted onto the student representative body in Year 12. I still remember the photos, and they were published in the press as well, of him at his Year 12 formal with 2 lovely-looking girls on his arm. He was very popular in that way, but he was completely devoid of any kind of emotional capacity. He met one of the victims over Facebook. They formed a relationship. He decided it was getting a little bit too much. He stole an SES vehicle, picked her up and stabbed her while he was driving. And after he stabbed her, she was still alive. He stabbed her in the chest a number of times while he was driving. And I still remember talking to him about it. And his biggest issue at that point was how he got away with it. And he drove around for about 3 hours with the victim bleeding next to him in the car, until he came across another victim, someone he knew from Corn, who was driving out the road and stopped on the side of the road and saw the first victim and was trying to help her. So he went to the back of the vehicle, got an axe, and hit her over the head with it. So he killed her as well. His primary, it didn't probably even raise his heart rate in doing so. Just did not care about the victims or the other people. Completely about his own well-being and his own safety, his own ability. The normal people, bear with me. Robert? Anybody going anywhere? Got anything to do? Here for a little while? Excellent. The normal people, I want to talk about the normal people quickly. I want to say normal people. These are people who have committed heinous acts of violence or aggression or murder, who we don't think have anything wrong with them. They're not mad or bad. We can't put any psychological diagnoses around them. Jason Downey, who committed the triple murder at Kapunda of the Rowe family, horrible, horrible. There were police, senior detective police, who reported they'd never seen a crime scene like it. Never seen the amount of blood like it. Just horrendous. He stabbed Mr. Rowe 29 times, the mother 50 times, and Chantel 30 odd times, and sexually assaulted her, and undressed her, and then redressed her. Just, and it was in the house for ages. You're just like, okay, something's going on with this guy, right? Something's happening here that's not right in terms of this guy. One of my most respected colleagues assessed him and produced the report, which was reported in the press, and the judge actually said, I don't believe the forensic psychologist. I'll read it out for you. This is what Richard said when he assessed him. I asked Mr. Downey what his motive was for the crime, and he replied, pretty much jealousy. I thought we, Chantel and I, had something on. When I learned she was with other guy, I wasn't happy. I got really angry. I didn't have anything against the parents. I just got really angry and frustrated. Right. So he went round and did that. And then Richard went on in the report and said, the community's response is to assume that the offender is a monster or seriously psychologically disturbed. The idea that an unremarkable member of the community can perpetrate such violence is unthinkable because it raises the possibilities that all individuals are capable of violence. And we are. It turns out, not that hard to kill somebody. The reality is that Mr. Downey's crimes are not a byproduct of severe psychopathology, but stem from the fallibility and flaws of the imperfect human condition. Just love how Richard phrased that. And the judge didn't believe it. The judge rejected that evidence and said, no, I just can't believe that. I saw the two guys, one of the young people who murdered a pensioner at Seacliff a few years ago, came from a good family, no psychological issues, no mental impairment, no personality disorders, no psychopathy, to all intents and purposes quite normal. I saw Stephen Peat, who murdered his girlfriend and her two children. Again, he wasn't the greatest guy on the earth, he was a bit pathetic, in fact. But nothing in his profile that I would have looked at and gone, yeah, this guy's going to kill somebody one day. Not like a Monte Estrada, not like J2 who killed a woman at Callington when he was 14. Not like a couple of other people I've seen who you look at their developmental profile and just go, you're going to do something really bad one day. Only a matter of time. These other guys, no, wouldn't have seen it coming. They've reacted in a situation in a certain way. Personality profile with a graphic equalizer. One of them was up, but not at a diagnosable level. Not that you could say, yeah, they're going to do something really bad one day. The last thing I'll talk about is murderers who haven't murdered. This is the concept of joint criminal enterprise or extended joint criminal enterprise. The legal concept of joint criminal enterprise is to capture gangs, outlaw motorcycle gangs or gangs of people who congregate in order to perpetrate crime against other people. Unfortunately, there is a subset of young people who a colleague of mine has interviewed over the last 3 years of her PhD, and we're just about to publish a paper, who have got the narratives from these young people. And most of them would tell you, one of them in fact resonates with me quite strongly. His mates came and picked him up. He was told that he was going to go to the hospital to see someone who had been beaten up. On the way, they took a deviation and went to an oval. He was told that they were getting involved in a fight with another group. He got out of the car. He ran around and he tried to not get killed by people who were swinging knives and bats and all the rest of it. He punched a couple of people and he got back in the car. Later on, he got arrested for murder because one of his companions had a knife and stabbed somebody and killed them. And therefore, he was charged with murder as extended joint criminal enterprise and gets the mandatory 20 years on top of it. It's an interesting legal proposition that I think we need to probably look at and challenge. You might be wondering about self-care as a forensic psychologist. Let me tell you about self-care. I'm interested in the human condition. I find it fascinating. I've got a job to do. I've got to prepare a report for the court so that they understand the individual. I've got a responsibility to make sure that I get the risk assessment right, to make sure that I'm informing the court correctly about risk of releasing this person into the community. I like people. I like stories. I'm interested in stories. That's why I do what I do. In terms of self-protection for myself, I have my own trauma markers and flags, that is, cases or histories of things that touch my own history that I know are going to be a vulnerability, that I will go and get supervision from a colleague immediately if I hear those stories. I know what they are. Or if I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed, then I will do the same thing. I'll go and talk to a colleague and seek some professional supervision and support. The other thing is I balance my cases. So I don't take on much forensic work. I do maybe 1 or 2 a week, and the rest are those psychological suitability assessments for res care. I do some nice things around wellbeing in organisations. I'm running a peer support program for the Royal Flying Doctors at the moment, and looking at wellbeing in lawyers, and I do nice things like that as well. So I balance my caseload, so I don't always deal with death and horrific stuff. So I get a bit of protection that way as well. Ladies and gentlemen, that's enough for me for the time being, but I think Robert has a microphone and we'll be taking questions.
I do. Thank you again, Luke. It's been a privilege listening to you. We do have time for some questions, so I'll just bring the mic around.
Hi. In terms of the judiciary, great word, I just made it up, when they're going through uni, do they do a course where it relates to the psychology of the people out there in the community, from the normal to the psychopathic? So they have a different understanding than that comes through the law. Because it sounded like that judge that you spoke about had no concept that there were people that were normal but capable of going beyond what was normal behaviour?
I think that's a good question. I don't think the judge in that case had a broad misunderstanding generally of human nature. I think what he was expressing in that case was just a disbelief that for such a horrendous crime, there wasn't something wrong with this guy. And the psychologists are going, no, nothing wrong with him. Can't really see anything wrong with him. He's a bit jealous. Other than that, can't really see much wrong with him. I think he was just expressing his disbelief in that. I think knowing the judge in that case is quite reasonably well versed in human nature. To answer your question, I don't think there is like a human psychology course within law as such, but I know a lot of the criminal solicitors and barristers around town, and they're an interesting bunch. And they work with people closely in the course of their advocacy or defence, whether they're prosecution or defence. They get to know pretty well. Not in the same way we do, but they get a fairly good view. By the time they reach the judiciary, they've gone through 10, 20 years of working with people close up and hopefully gleaning a little from the reports we've read over time. I've done in-services and education for the Bar Association, for the barristers, for the judges and for solicitors as well. They're always interested in hearing about psychopathy and why people do things. And they will generally, you'll read in the sentencing remarks on the Court Administration Authority website, which is a good read if you're ever interested. I'm on there all the time. Cases that have gone through where judges will reference psychological reports when they're trying to understand human nature and why people have done things, and reference it in their sentencing remarks. So, no, not specifically, but I think over time they get a fairly good idea, and then they listen to experts.
Any other questions?
Hi. In the case of children between 10 and 14, where you report whether they know what they've done is wrong, do you, if the ones that you've decided didn't know when they go free, do you keep an eye on them? Or?
Well, yeah, probably personally would be a good idea. Well, no. I think the answer there would be no. If people are found, if children are found dolly incapax, it means that they're not sufficiently mature to understand that what they did was wrong rather than just naughty, which means that they can't be convicted of a criminal act, which means they don't go to court, there's no guilty finding, and there's no bond or there's no supervision that comes after it. However, most of the cases I've been involved in, there is behaviour there which is concerning, so we would want to make sure that they are so I'll make recommendations then around, well, they might not have understood that what they did was wrong and it was actually naughty, but it's still behaviour that we don't want to see again. So the recommendation is that they need to go and see this psychologist and go and see this doctor and make sure that they're going through a process to ensure that they don't do that naughty act again. You think if it's a naughty act, if you sit down with a child and say that's naughty and it causes harm to the person, and they can say, oh, right, yeah, okay, yeah, I understand that now, then with some rehabilitation therapy as well, they're much reduced in their risk of doing that again.
And also, do you have to 100% back yourself, even knowing that the advances in technology and science could one day say your evidence or your diagnosis was wrong? Because
it's a good question. Do I 100% back myself? The attitude that I take in assessment is that my opinion is brought on the evidence which is before me. So if I don't know a factual piece of information, I can't weigh that in decision making. So I make the best judgment that I can based on the evidence that is laid out in front of me. When I'm being cross-examined in court, and that's fun, it's actually really interesting. I'll be one of those few quite masochistic psychologists. Most psychologists run a mile from court. I like going to court. I find it really engaging because I know that I know my area better than lawyers do. So I don't want to be bloody sharp if they're cross-examining, and some of them are. So it's a really good kind of sparring in a way. And do you back yourself 100%? No, because you might get asked a question that causes you, or a piece of factual information gets induced which causes you to waver on your opinion. But I've learned over time and through experience that's not what happens. Opposing barristers, when you're being cross-examined, will throw a hypothetical. What if they were this? Well, they're not. Where's the evidence that says that they are? So you can't afford as an expert to get led down that path of, oh, well, if they were there, then I suppose that would happen. You just can't afford to get led there. So yes, there's a degree of confidence you need to have in your opinion, but you need to be on your feet, especially in court, thinking about what evidence is being put out in front of you. And look, down the track, if a factual piece of information that's brought on advancing technology is put in front of me, I'm happy to review a decision.
Got some hands over this side.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was really good. Can you make any comment on the nature versus nurture in children? And you know how some little kids kick ducks in the park and you see them and you want to kill them? Or they torture dogs? You know, what's that about? When other normal kids would not do that sort of thing, they won't engage in that behaviour, but you see sometimes kids that are quite violent towards defenceless animals. Have you got any comment on that?
Oh, I've got lots of comments on that. It used to be that harm to animals, and it still is to an extent, that harm to animals is a really strong precursor for propensity for violence down the track. There's been a bit of evidence and research coming through to undermine that a little bit, but it's still one of those hallmark factors that I would look at and say, how has that child got to a position where they are so lacking in empathy that they are prepared to perpetrate harm, violence to an animal for their own pleasure? So yeah, look, I think that would be a bit of a concern, to put it mildly. In the nature-nurture debate, as I said before, we know that there are genetic predispositions. I have met people, sexual offenders and perpetrators of violence, who I've looked through their developmental history and have not been able to find anything that would lead me to think that they were going to do what they did. So you're thinking there has to be a genetic predisposition there. Most of the genetic research would suggest that it's less than half so about 47% of what we're seeing in adult behaviour is genetically predetermined and can be influenced by people's lifestyle growing up. Mostly what I've seen, the majority of cases, I'd hate to put a figure on it, but I'd say the majority of cases I've seen, you can see the developmental markers. So a child who is harming an animal, has been abused themselves physically, has been through neglect or violence or sexual abuse of some sort that have got them to the point where they're lacking empathy and care and responsibility. And again, that heightened autonomic arousal threshold, they don't get excited by playing soccer or playing cars in the yard. That they need something else to feel stimulated and to get that adrenaline rush. That's one of the things that does it. Low empathy for other people and other children, because that's what they've been, animals, because that's what's been done to them over time. And you've got the perfect storm. And yeah, it's a worry.
A couple more questions over.
Hi. I'm a private investigator and I do a lot of work with DCP. And I'm very interested in what you're talking about, the concept between naughty and wrong. In that I see you've got generations of kids who are DCP generational kids. as you were talking about. How do you define, if somebody's been brought up in a particular environment where behaviours are normalised, how do they know it's wrong?
They don't.
Yeah. So how do you... So is that part of your assessment, that this person has been brought up in an environment where, you know, it is perfectly normal to beat, abuse, rape children?
That argument spins both ways, because if a child's been brought up in that environment, they may not appreciate what the norms are, but on the converse, it may give them an absolute viewpoint on what the norms should be. So there's more to it than that as well. It's then about the evidence which suggests that they knew what they were doing was going to cause harm, or should know that it was going to cause harm to another person. Versus we're just kind of playing around. Sorry?
Because that behaviour caused harm to them.
Because it caused harm to them. So either they're insightful about that or they're not insightful about that. And it's generally, I've not seen much in terms of dieting impacts under 12. So around about 12 is where it pivots for mine in terms of what my experience and what I've seen of children who start to understand. So about 10, especially with sexual behaviours and sexual experimentation, but this caused harm to an 8-year-old, and it's been done in coercive circumstances. So should they have known that was going to cause harm, or is it just that they thought they were playing doctors and nurses? That's the decision we've got to make. Yeah, it's a tricky one. Well, it's the decision the court's got to make.
A couple more questions, Lee?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm happy to stay.
Yeah, so just sort of thoughts on the treatment of drug-induced psychosis versus other sort of factors, and do you look at it differently, and is it treated differently, or should the courts look at it differently?
Oh, 4 questions in there. Courts have a fairly dim view, which is enshrined in the Criminal Law Consolidation Act, about drug and alcohol intoxication. So it's just not a mitigating factor. The judge will weigh it and say you were heavily intoxicated, but then they'll go, well, it doesn't matter. You should have known what you were doing. When it comes to drug-induced psychosis, psychosis is psychosis. So if you're in a psychotic state, the judge isn't necessarily looking at how you got into a psychotic state, and it's quite prevalent for people who are in a psychotic state to have gone through a drug-induced psychosis. Most drug-induced psychosis is early onset, so prodromal phases are sort of 17, 18, 19, and you see the psychotic behaviour starting through there. Then it either ceases with cessation of drug use, or it continues on after cessation of drug use. That's when you know you've got a major problem. Is it treated any differently? No, I don't think it is. It's weighed, but it's not treated any differently. If you're psychotic, you're psychotic. They're not really looking at how you got there at that point. And difference between drug-induced psychosis and influence by drugs. So there would need to be evidence that you were psychotic in the months and years, weeks, months and years leading up to the event. Not just that you were completely fine and normal, everything was great, and then you smoked something which didn't agree with you and you got into a psychotic state. It's certainly going to be a mitigating factor, but it's going to be treated a little bit differently.
I just wanted to ask you on the criminal enterprise and company where you have people induce other people in their company to commit crimes, and you seem to have your reservations about whether or not they should be held accountable for, and this is a relatively new aspect in modern crime that I've seen, whereby we never took into consideration in the past that you would be somehow culpable by way of inducing another person, and you have your reservations about that, and yet it seems to be a new trend. Why do you feel that there should be a lighter take on people that...
That's a good question. Any of these things I've talked about, I could have spent a whole hour on, and joint criminal enterprise and extended joint criminal enterprise, I could spend another hour on. So you're sitting comfortably. Let's, but I won't. I have reservations about it for a certain subsection of the offending population. So, don't get me wrong, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a lawmaker or a policy maker, but for what it's worth in terms of my opinion, the idea with joint criminal enterprise is to capture the person who facilitated the crime and give them equal punishment, because without that person, so person A and person B is the stabber and person A is the driver. Or the inciter or whatever it might be. Yeah, absolutely, got no problem with that at all. So without A, B wouldn't be able to stab the person because B knew that he could get in the car and drive away. So they're both culpable, got no problem with that at all. But they planned it, and they should have, and this is where the law around joint criminal enterprise is that the person should have been able to foresee that the potential consequences of either his actions or her actions and the other person's actions as well. We are going here, we're going to do this thing. Whatever this thing is, the court is going to say you should have probably known that somebody could end up dead out of that. Therefore, and you didn't change the course of your behaviour. So you didn't stop what you were doing, and you could have. The problem I have is that neurodevelopmentally, the frontal lobes don't mature until early mid-20s. So we've got 17, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds being tried for violent crimes where they have diminished frontal lobe capacity to be able to reason and plan and foresee, which is about what that law is about. You're able to foresee that the consequence of your action was going to be X, Y, and Z. People before the age of 22, I don't know if anybody's experienced anybody in the age of children in the age of 17 to 22, not great on foresight, planning, consequence analysis, and generally looking at what might happen if, and then devising some alternative strategies. And we know as well with teenagers that when they get involved in peer groups, they're very easily influenced by peer behaviour. So if somebody's going off and doing X, then they have a diminished capacity with that frontal lobe lack of development to be able to say, yeah, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. I'm going to go and do something else instead. So that's what I think. And then the whole thing about, those examples that I talked about, it's not that somebody sat down with me and said, we're going to a park and we're going to stab somebody. And I go, yeah, cool, that sounds good, let's get into that. It's where like I described it, that's what the narrative was of the young person. Somebody came around, they picked me up, we said, we're going for a drive, we're going to the hospital. Along the way, we ended up detouring and going to an oval where a bloody great big fight broke out. And I was frightened for my life, scared shitless, thought I was going to get killed. So I was doing everything I could to not get killed. I might have punched a few people, I didn't have a weapon on me. All of a sudden I've been charged with murder. So proportionally, that person should be charged with something. They were there, they participated in violence, but murder with 20 years at 19?
Any other questions? No? Okay. I'm sure Luke, you can get buttonholed in this sentence, but that's fine. But, ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to join in again thanking Luke Broomhall very much for his speech tonight. We hope we can have Raising the Bar Adelaide again next year, subject to our friends in New York giving us the licence. Thank you.